So it seems that Warhammer 40k's new balance data slate is here. There's some massive changes to factions and units, some big nerfs and some really good feel-good changes for their armies. Let's talk about what we've got and how it might change each 40k faction. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where it seems that it's balanced data slate day once more. In this video I thought we'd go through each faction in the game in turn, talking through any changes that they had and how it changes their army's play at the moment. Looks like the balanced data slate has arrived on a Wednesday again. That was the same as the last one. In general, it generally tended to be Wednesdays or Thursdays. Looks like Wednesday might be the pattern going forward unless anything disrupts it. This one's part of Games Workshop's 3 monthly balance update cycles. They generally do some rules changes and points changes once every 3 months these days, and this one was expected to be an extra big one given that it comes alongside the launch of a new mission deck, so it felt like if they were going to do anything drastic for Warhammer 40k, it was probably going to happen now. To round up the content of the thing, there's the balanced data slate itself. That's the one where they make rules changes to a bunch of different factions. This time around it doesn't look like there's any core rules changes here, so not messing around with stratagem generation at a core rules kind of level as was hinted, but there's plenty of stuff that have changed for individual factions. Then there's the points updates from the Munitorum field manual. The vast majority of factions have had changes. It feels like maybe there's a few more buffs overall compared with nerfs this time around, though there's certainly some factions that have been hit hard. There's the chapter approved tournament companion to go alongside the mission deck, and that has some fairly standard stuff, though perhaps the most interesting thing for a bunch of people might be the 40k base sizing guide that it has in it. Pretty useful to actually have an official source that tells you what units are ideally meant to be on, even if it doesn't really have any sway outside of tournament games. There's new detachments, as was rumoured for the Dark Angels, Chaos Space Marines and Tyranids. I'll mention them as a very quick overview with their relevant armies here, though I think I'll do the next video going through each of them in turn. And then there's some more FAQs for Thousand Suns, World Eaters and Death Guard. And there's also the new Kill Team datasheets from Kill Team Typhon as well. I guess that must be just around the corner now. But there's 2 new datasheets for Tyranid Raveners and a Servitor Battleclade. Again, I'll probably aim to cover those more in depth in their own video. For the most part, the leaks and rumour roundup that I did the last week does seem to be broadly correct. Looks like perhaps the thing that was most off was the rumours of core stratagem changes, which doesn't seem to have been the case. It seems to just be Guilliman and Hive Tyrants that have been affected there. But the majority of the general vibes for a bunch of different factions do broadly seem to have been correct otherwise. Things like massive buffs to the Dark Angels, some nerfs for Emperor's Children and Orks, and some specific changes for things like Aeldari. For core rules things first, it probably is just worth mentioning that all this comes on the backdrop of the new mission deck. I covered that in its own video, though for a very broad brush overview of the changes, they've got those new challenger cards, and that means that if you're 6 points or more behind at the start of a battle round, then you get a small bonus, either a stratagem or an easy mission to do, and it could be a way to catch up. It is a little bit of an unusual idea. They've had a kind of mixed reception. I don't feel like they're going to be so impactful that they necessarily ruin games or anything. It was definitely not hard to imagine a situation where they could basically make one player win more compared with before. Otherwise, they had a small tweak to tactical secondary missions. You can now discard them at the end of either player's turn, not just yours. So say if you had a defend objective one and your opponent stopped you from getting it, you can drop that one to draw more. You just only get the command point if you drop it in your own turn. That felt like a simple and effective change to me. There were a whole ton of at least relatively minor changes to primary and secondary missions, plus a couple of new ones. I'd argue that the vast majority of these weren't really all that meaningful, at least not in the way that you build and construct your army. Most of them felt like either quality of life changes or just common sense changes to prevent any one mission advantaging one player more than the other. And a bunch of the secondary missions stop you scoring just very high or having completely impossible ones for the most part. Otherwise in the mission deck there's some nice support for incursion games and asymmetric missions, both of which look fun for casual games. Nice to have a bit more thought put into them, even if I'd argue the incursion games aren't really all that different compared with the Strike Force. And now it seems they've decided to basically make the mission rule things non-mandatory and rebranded them twists. To be honest, if anything, I'd say they're a weaker element of the deck now, just because previously the mission rules could be pretty usable in any given game, whereas now there's plenty of ones that don't really give one player a huge advantage, where there's a couple of them that just seem outright broken if you're facing a melee army versus a shooting army, multiple ones that give just ridiculous advantages to the melee player that probably aren't a great idea to use in more casual games unless you really want to give them a massive advantage versus the shooting army player. To go alongside the mission deck, there's the Tournament Companion revealed. We knew the general gist of what was coming from this from Art of War stream last week, and for the most part it's kind of similar to the last one. It contains the mission setup checklist, largely similar to the mission deck, but just presuming that you're playing in a tournament, so making some tweaks to wording and not talking about stuff that isn't relevant in that setting. They've then got the Games Workshop terrain layouts and the advised missions to play on them. A couple of the terrain layouts have been very slightly altered, but not to a crazy extent, and they don't use all the missions in the mission deck. They don't have Burden of Trust or Unexploded Ordnance, both of which seem sensible given that they were ones that were more frequently criticised for go first advantage and things. The mission deck also makes the change that the no prisoners secondary can't be taken fixed in tournament style games. That was a change that the mission deck made to say that you could take it fixed, but it then have only limited it to more casual games. That one feels just like a bit of a weird change to me. In more casual games, at least in my experience, people don't tend to go for the fixed objectives quite so much. Just seems like the sort of thing that creating a distinction between tournament and casual style games just wasn't really needed there. As mentioned though, it was interesting to see a Games Workshop official base sizing guide. This isn't something that they've done for a really long time, and it has usually been one that certain tournaments out there have had to provide themselves sometimes, or use something like WTC basing guides. It is quite nice to have that from an official source, and in general these tend to reflect the base sizes that Games Workshop sell their models with now. They've got great big lists for every single faction and the base sizes that they come with. Obviously no obligation to use this outside of tournament play games, but I think it is a helpful resource even for more casual games potentially. Like say for example if you're making a cool conversion and you want it to represent one given model, this will give you the size that you should be aiming at, and might be handy enough if you're playing with a model on a different base size just to try and help you not gain advantages from doing so. In any case though, mission deck and tournament companion aside, let's talk through the factions. And first up we have the changes to the Space Marines. Currently they've been a bit all or nothing, with Ultramarines being rather dominant for them and most other chapters not having quite so much success. It seems they have decided to make changes to 2 Ultramarine characters. Marneus Calgar only generates command points if he's the Warlord now, so for a more optimised list it just no longer makes sense to have him in the same army as Guilliman, as you're losing out on a huge advantage and Guilliman has to be the Warlord. He does drop down to 200 points though. Otherwise, Rabute Guilliman himself drops down to 325 points, though his discounted stratagem rule has been toned down a bit. As with the Tyranid Hive Tyrant, it now gives you only 1 discounted stratagem per battle round, as opposed to 1 per turn. Previously, you could be having, say, Armour of Contempt in the enemy turn and a damage dealer stratagem in yours, so it's not going to be quite as impactful as he was. Overall, that is probably a small nerf to Ultramarines, given that lots of lists were running both Guilliman and Calgar. But also given that they got points decreases at the same time, it doesn't really seem that bad at all. I could easily see you building around either of these at the heart of an Ultramarines list if you wanted to. Guilliman still seems kind of game warping between those discounted stratagems and double Oath of Moment plus his combat stats. Otherwise though, Aggressor's got a big decrease. They are now 100 points for 3 or 220 per 6, so a bit more expensive for the big squad. They're definitely a unit that needed a points decrease. Hopefully they'll be a bit more interesting. They generally tended to be used in 6s for big damage combos and things. I wonder if the cheaper small squad might actually give them a look for that role now. Heavy Intercessors go down to 100 per 5. That seems like a sensible change to me as they weren't being used all that much. The Jump Captain drops down to 75. That's great news for the Blood Angels that were already using him already. It's pretty reasonable with 10 Jump Intercessors even outside of that though. Only 235 points for a lot of Space Marines with chainswords and free stratagems there. Vanguard Veterans drop down to 95 points, so a big decrease from 110. Again, that'll be excellent for the Blood Angels. Raven Guard players might enjoy that too. And finally, Help Blasters drop down to 110 points from 115, so a very small decrease there, but to a unit that we used really quite a lot in casual games, they're easy to get some good value out of. I feel like they're really not so far away from being pretty interesting for competitive, but at the moment they tend to get left on the shelf. Overall, broadly seems like good news for Space Marine players though. A fair few scattered points decreases, and both of the Ultramarines characters still seem very good. Perhaps the bigger nerf is that you just don't want to combine them. Next up, things are a bit more mixed for the Astra Militarum though. They're a faction that seemed, as often as the case, to be a bit of a mixed bag. Overall tournament win rate's quite low at 45% or so the average player not doing so great with them, but then skilled players still managing to win grand tournaments with them. It seems that overall the top list of the faction might well have been nerfed. Lehman Russes go up to 185 points for the standard battle tank with the rerolls, which is a little bit on the painful side. Tauroxes go up to 75. They were being used in multiples to deliver Kazakin. I feel like it's far more of a debate between that and the Chimera now with all of its extra heavy weapons. Ursula Creed goes up to 85 points, which again is a fairly painful increase from 65. Again, she was a competitive staple with her discounted stratagems and her good order efficiency. And then the Death Corps of Creed 20-man infantry squad has gone up to 145 points, so unchanged for the small squad, but a big plus 15 for the big squad, and that feels like a very nasty points change to me. I say they were a unit that was playable and was alright for taking the midboard, but didn't really seem like it was undercosted to me. Otherwise, Borgrins dropped to 100 points per 3, so down 10. The Tempestus Aquilons to 100 points from 110. I feel like they're fairly interesting, and that feels a bit more reasonable for paying the premium for the 6-inch deep strike now. And then the Death Riders down to 60 points. Though to me I'd still say they need to be actually cheaper than the Rough Riders to get much of a look in there. I just don't think that the reactive move rule is worth losing out on all the damage. It's a shame not to see some points decreases to Marshal Dreyer as well. Otherwise, they did get one rules change in Lord Solar being able to order Titanic units again. That really is quite a nice change for lovers of Baneblades and things. It'll make them a little bit more viable for more casual games. I still wouldn't say that they're going to be overall strong though. Overall, it's a small but meaningful nerf to top guard list. Torroks, Leman Russes, Ursula Creed, and the Deathcorps Krieg infantry were all being used, and the buffs really don't make up for that so much. Feels like Guard will probably drop a tiny bit in terms of win rates, and certainly at Grand Tournament performance, even if they've still got plenty of strong things that they can fall back on. Kind of interesting to see no changes to the commonly included Rogue or Dawn tank commander. Out of anything, they still seem to be the single most auto-include unit in Guard lists, just both being a good source of tank orders and big damage in themselves. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. They're one option to get some 40k terrain on the board. They'll do things quite differently to other terrain sets out there, their idea being a whole bunch of terrain that can store completely flat for ease of transport and storage. The idea is that their battlefield is made up of 12 cardboard tiles, arranged 3x4 to make a 45 by 60 inch grid, and that's the same size as a regular size board for Warhammer 40k these days. Each of the tiles then basically unfolds and up pops a building, so it's sort of pop-up cardboard terrain basically. And that means that you can have a battlefield that can store completely flat in a box set the same size as, say, a normal sized board game or similar. It's really quite easy to set up and tear down, say if you're having a game around at a friend's house or something like that, and also doesn't need any hobby effort put into it to get an effective board of terrain if you have limited time and most of that's going into your army. I'll leave them links down in the video description if you'd like to check them out, and I'll cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video as well to talk through a few of their offerings. There are some trade-offs to their cardboard terrain system versus others as well, and it won't be for everyone, so I'll talk through the pros and cons at the end of the video too. In any case though, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Moving on with the Imperial factions, and next up we have the Adeptus Custodes. Seems that they didn't really get all that many changes, just slightly cheaper Allarus Custodian Terminators. They dropped down 5 points per model, so previously they were basically 65 points each, now they're down to 60 points, and all their squad sizes reflect that. Seems at least fairly reasonable to leave the Custodes kind of similar to where they were. Most of their units are in a fairly good place right now, and these guys were already seeing play. They just generally tended to be in the lines of the Emperor, where you can do things like split up a big unit and have them teleporting all over the board. I guess that's a buff to lines of the Emperor style list, and makes these a lot more interesting for other lists beyond that as well, where maybe they tended to get passed up for Guard or Wardens. Custodes were doing alright before though, and this is a small boost to them. Next up, for the Adeptus Mechanicus, they've got a fair few buffs as well. They were an army that was on the lower side of the Warhammer 40k power balance at the moment, so nice enough to see some improvements here. Seems like this one's finally the update where they decided to give the Castellan robots Doctrina Imperatives. Really quite a nice big boost there, and it seems that they stay the same points as well. So that means they're going to be able to take Conqueror Doctrina wherever they want, for example. Being able to advance and shoot is nice for them and gain extra AP. It'll also make them a far more efficient unit for the vast majority of detachments out there. As a result, they've also tweaked a couple of rules that could give them Doctrina Imperatives. The Halo Screed enhancement is now cheaper and just makes them a Halo unit all game long, and the Cybernetica cohort now gives them plus 2 inch movement and plus 1 objective control. That still feels like it's a solid boost to the Castellans, given that movement is probably their biggest weakness and trying to make their weight be felt. It doesn't strike me that they're going to be quite so standout in the Cybernetica Legion compared with elsewhere though now. Otherwise, for points changes, the Chicken Walkers drop down 5 points each, the Iron Strider Ballistari are now down to 70 points, and the Taser Dragoons are down to 65. The cheap ones stayed untouched. Both of these were already solid units. That probably is enough to push them up to be a bit more standout than they were. They've just got fairly efficient, nice defensive stats and damage output for the cost, and can be used for a small unit fast interference role too. It still seems that maybe the king of the anti-tank is going to be the Scorpius Disintegrator though. For some reason this one dropped down from 175 to 165. And that seems fairly meaningful for a bunch of AdMech lists, as it did seem like the single unit that was being most for the dedicated anti-tank style option. So it seems they're probably going to be even more included than they were previously, and that doesn't seem like a small power boost to the faction. Finally, they've gained the datasheet for their Servitor Battleclade, which is coming out in Kill Team Typhon. That one gives you 9 Servitor bodies for a cheap 60 points. They generally have some close range anti-infantry fire, plus a couple of slightly heavier weapons. Might be nice enough for a cheap interference unit, and if you lead them with a Tech Priest, then they get to advance an action and shoot an action. I'm not necessarily sure that that's the biggest advantage in the world though. Just doesn't normally seem like they'd be the sort of unit that you justify Tech Priest for anyway. I guess maybe could be a dedicated objective team in support of a Techno-Archaeologist or something. They'll certainly have some competition with the battle line troops, which you generally want in good numbers to activate a bunch of other army buffs. In any case, I'll talk through their datasheet a bit more in their own video. Overall though, that's a bunch of fairly feels-good changes for the AdMech. Nice to see the Castellan robots becoming even more prominent than they were. Looks like several of the AdMech danger units have got more threatening. Next up, we've got the Grey Knights, who didn't really see too many changes. They've got a codex not so very far away. They had another small tweak to the Warpbane Task Force detachment rule. This is the one that gives them rerolls within their zones of control. Previously they gained the rerolls just with ones outside of the zone of control and then reroll everything within. Then Games Workshop nerfed it so that you couldn't get it out of line of sight anymore, not wanting to give full hit rerolls to purgation squads it would seem, and now it's been tweaked once more, so that line of sight is only needed for ranged attacks, as occasionally you'd have the weird sort of thing where it gets in the way. If you say had a unit fighting in melee through a ruined wall and not able to see their targets, then that would prevent their hit rerolls there. Basically, if that's the case though, you still get your full hit rerolls, you only need line of sight for ranged attacks now. Otherwise, points haven't changed so very much. The Brotherhood Champion drops down to 70 points if you want some fights first in a unit. It's definitely a bit more tempting at that price tag. And then the 10-man squads of Terminators now just double the cost of the small squad, as opposed to being more than that. So the Brotherhood Terminators are either 200 or 400, and Paladins are either 215 or 430. That does seem sensible enough to me, to be honest. In general, Grey Knight players tended to run them in small squads anyway in the past, so I'm not really sure why the bigger squads of Terminators needed to have a higher points cost. Overall, nothing really huge changing for the Grey Knights. I guess more things will happen when they get their codex. For the Imperial Knights, it looks like all digital rules are unchanged there. I guess their codex will be following fairly swiftly after the Chaos Knights, so it didn't really make sense to have any big rules changes for this one, I guess. Feels like there's a good chance it could be either next week or the one after, maybe. Until they get any codex updates, they'll still be one of the very scariest factions out there just for sheer damage and defense. Often Canis Rex leading a huge amount of armigers tends to be one of the go-to lists right now. Just lots of big threats, plenty of armor, and the armigers are solid on the objective game. Seems like they'll be getting a fairly big shake-up relatively soon though. For the Sisters of Battle, it looks like Games Workshop have given them a fairly generous amount of buffs here. Really quite a lot of points decreases, plus some special rule changes. Sisters has a pretty strong, well-received and interesting codex in 10th edition. It got some big points increases as a result, and then Games Workshop decided to throw some absolutely enormous faction nerfs at them, with big nerfs to detachments and units. After that, they reversed a nerf or two, and it seems like they're sort of middling for tournament win rates, though very, very few people are playing them. But for this one, they seem to have really quite a lot of meaningful points cuts, plus some special rule changes. First up, the Champions of Faith detachment, so that's the one that focuses on the Sacrosants and the Paragon Warsuits. Previously you had to pay to activate those units with Miracle Dice, now you just get those units completely for free. 3 of them get to be activated to use your detachment rule per turn, and those units are the ones that can make better use of the stratagems as well. That feels like that's probably going to be enough to tip that from being a kind of on-played detachment to one that's genuinely quite good. Both the Celestian Sacrosants and the Paragon Warsuits are strong units for the Codex currently, and the Paragons even got a bit cheaper now. You're also able to select units that are in transports as well, so that's really quite a nice quality of life thing for Sacrosants making their way up the board in Rhinos. For Zephyrim, when they make a charge now, they both get sustained hits and the Lance keyword without having to pay a Miracle Dice. They just have to have made a charge for that to take effect. And this buff now applies to all melee weapons in the squad. Previously it just called out their power weapons, so it can now apply to attached jump canonesses. Again, that's a good boost for the unit. Not having to choose one or the other, or spend Miracle Dice for it, will make them hit harder. Finally, for rules changes, the Retributor squad got a very nice improvement and also went down to 115 points as well. They now just reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 against everything, so basically getting a plus 36% damage boost on their multi-melter base stat lines. And then for their Retribution style rule, if they target an enemy unit that's killed a Sisters of Battle unit at some point in the game, they get plus 1 to hit and wound instead. It is kind of weird as against some targets like say toughness 4 or below, it looks like they'll actually get worse against those after they've slain a unit, which is a bit on the odd side of things, but it will be a better boost against the vast majority of enemies, and particularly against tough armoured targets they might want to go after. Wounding tanks and vehicles on a 4+ with multi-melters is a big boost. Otherwise though, they got lots of points cuts. The Sanctifiers were first added into the Codex at 100 points, so they could be an interesting enough close-range flame style unit. Feels like they rival for the Dominions with that role. Castigators dropped down to 160, which is rather great, as they're one of the staple units to give AP buffs and some long-range firepower. Immolators dropped down to 115 points, also very good with their ability to split Battle Sister squads, so they're in a lot of lists anyway. Paragon Warsuits dropped down to 210 from 220, not an enormous boost, but very good on a unit that's already very competitive, particularly with more than Var. Junitha Rita drops down to 80 points, that's pretty nice with her command point farming. The Triumph is 235, and that still seems like a bit too much for its benefits at the moment in my opinion. Retributes are looking nice at 115 with that big boosted datasheet rule, and Seraphim dropped down to 80 and 160. They're pretty solid for secondaries and their move shoot move style thing, and can be pretty scary in Bringers of Flame if using the enhancement I guess. Weirdly enough, it looks like Sisters Repentia are marked down as dropping by 10 points, though actually seem to be unchanged at 85 to 170. I guess maybe the green text is the mistake there as opposed to the points cost. Overall, it looks like it's a really big improvement for the Sisters. I guess they'll be a lot more strong and competing with the top armies a significant amount better now. Loads of units look good with that. Zephyrim and Retributors both look like they're worth a second look. Staples that were already good like the Castigator and the Paragon suits and the Immolator all went down. And Champions of Faith is looking a lot more interesting now. It was just completely unviable when you had to spend that amount of Miracle Dice on it. For the Imperial Agents, I'm afraid it's less good news. It still just looks like Games Workshop's not intending to balance these as a regular faction. No points decreases, no faction rule unless you're using them as allies. Looks like they're still mainly intended to be an army mainly for fun and fluff style games, which probably isn't great feels for people who tried to jump into them and collect them as an army when they released a codex for them. Finally, for the Imperium though, we've got the Divergent Space Marine chapters, and starting out we've got the Blood Angels, which have just got a rather remarkable set of massive points decreases. Blood Angels did seem to have fallen off quite a bit in terms of tournament performance. Despite some solid datasheets and a good detachment, they dropped down to around about 45% win rates at grand tournaments. I guess partly driven when they couldn't have their weird sort of red Ultramarine style build where you didn't take Blood Angels units and then gain boosted oath the moment. Though I was still kind of surprised they dropped quite this far with some solid datasheets and detachments. In any case though, the points decreases they've got are kind of wild. Sanguinary Guard are now 110 points for 3 of them and 240 per 6. They were already played in just about every Blood Angels army list. The 110 point version of them is just absolutely mad, and the 241 is really efficient as well. Looks like they'll both be great with Dante and in smaller units if you want to run them that way. Jump Death Company go down, they're 120 or 230 now, so dropped 10 on both squad builds there. And on top of that, both Astarath and Lamates went down 10 points too. Generally, people tended to prefer 10 of them with Lamates who used them, so that's been very directly buffed as well. The Sanguinary Priest is looking more tempting at 75 points. He was realistically too much before at 90 points, but with his extra AP and his Feel No Pain type thing, now he might be tempting. The Death Company Dreadnought drops down to 160 points. It can do some scary surge moves, is a bit tougher, and has some fairly savage melee threats compared with the Brutalis. Dante's down to 120, and again he was fine already. Mephiston's down to 120 as well. Maybe looks like he might be the go-to lone operative once again instead of the Sanguinor, though he's still very nice with his jump into heroic intervention style thing. And the Brawl Predator drops down to 125 points. Again, that one feels like more of a necessary change, as it was a bit on the overcosted side before in my opinion. They also really like some of the core Space Marine changes as well. Vanguard Veterans down to 95 points, and Jump Captains down to 75. That'll be excellent for Angelic Inheritors, but just leading either Vanguard Veterans or Jump Intercessors both look really viable for them now. Finally, as if all the points decreases weren't enough, Black Rage just got a significant boost. The Death Company now have the OC0 and can't fall back effects cancelled by any Blood Angels character within 6 inches. Previously it was just chaplains within 12 inches, but being able to do it with other characters is rather great. It means that you might actually be tempted by the Death Company Blood Angels captains now. Previously there was just no point taking them rather than the chaplains, and also all sorts of other characters could provide that buff in support as well. So if you've got multiple captains moving up the board alongside Death Company, then units without characters could be a lot more viable. Overall, all this seems kind of weirdly generous, perhaps particularly for the Sanguinary Guard and things like the Jump Captains and several other things. Looks like lots of staples that were already good got buffs. I guess this would probably be enough to propel Blood Angels from being towards the lower end of the meta to one of the stronger armies in the game with these changes, though I guess we'll see how well it impacts them. For the Dark Angels, they didn't get any points changes, though they got a nice buff to Lionel Johnson, and they also got a brand new detachment as well. For the Lion, he's still the same 315 points, but basically his supporting rules got way better. Previously his Primarch sort of choice of 3 different special rules buff was a bit on the underwhelming side in my opinion. It looks like 2 of those have been swapped out. The debuff stratagems up close one has been swapped for a return to reserves. That's really quite a big ability on such a powerful model. Should mean that he's never going to be too isolated in a game and can pop up to maybe help support other units, perhaps even with heroic intervention and things. Then his Martial Exemplar buff is far better in melee, and that gives him a very direct boost to his own combat prowess. Previously this was an aura of +1 to hit for melee units within 6 inches, and that wouldn't affect him as he already hits on a 2+. Now that's shifted to an aura of reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1, and that's a pretty spectacular boost to his own profile, usually adding up to around about a +36% damage increase, though complicated a little bit by his choice of keywords. Either way, he's way more dangerous in combat if you have this active. Then finally the Emperor's Shield has basically swapped out its slightly weird Mortal Wound bounce back special rule, and instead it's a -1 to wound if the strength of the attack is greater than the toughness of him. That's also pretty massive. It was already solidly playable before these changes happened, and it's looking really great now they have. It was already taken in a bunch of Dark Angel, Stormlance and Gladius lists. I'm sure he'll be taken in far more now. Otherwise, the Dark Angels also have their new detachment as well. This one's called the Wrath of the Rock. It looks like this one's a balanced Dark Angels making war detachment, and again seems to be another flavour of Deathwing and Ravenwing working hand in hand to take down the enemies of the chapter. On the face of it, it does look like the rules are pretty interesting, and certainly feels like it could tempt some players away from taking either Stormlance or Gladius, as most tend to at the moment. The core rules are helpful one in giving you some more durability to infantry and mounted units. They're all -1 to wound if the strength is greater than their toughness, and that feels very directly helpful to both Deathwing Knights and Ravenwing Bikers, both of which are kind of likely to be targeted by weapons that wound them on a 3 or better. I'll go through the detachment options in more detail in the detachment video later, but for a few interesting ones, there's a 2 command point stratagem to redesignate the Oath of Moment target within 12 inches of a character. Quite nice to get some more big rerolls when you slay your nominated Oath target. There's an advanced shoot and charge one, which I think is a really big one for things like Deathwing Knights trying to make it into melee, and that's one of the reasons that the Space Marine detachments have been quite so popular. And then there's the option for Deathwing models to charge the enemy in their own turn within 6 inches of them. Usually that often costs 2 command points. So for this one, for Deathwing, it only costs 1, and you could also do it with other units at 3 inches as well, so they can still defend objectives pretty well with that. Overall, it's looking pretty immense at first impressions. I'll cover it properly in a full video later though. Next up, it seems the Space Wolves get their Codex points. As of a Launchbox army, they have both their index points and their Codex points listed side by side. The idea is that these ones are for people who happen to have picked up the new units and things, or want to run the Codex in casual games at the moment. The Games Workshop's intention is that they don't go live for tournament games until the full Codex and release wave comes out. Previously, when we've seen these sort of interim points costs, they've generally just been translated fully into the actual official points costs, when it does come to have the main release wave and remove the index points. And as a result, it's possible that a few tournaments and things might allow these to actually be played there. Broadly speaking, the vast majority of these look either fairly similar to the actual printed Codex value, or the ones that we had showcased from content creators last weekend. A fair few things look interesting. Thunderwolves at 100 points certainly seems like a very respectable stat line for that cost. Beyond the Fell-Handed looks solid at 170 points with his command point farming and Big Danger. The Battle Leader seems like a nice efficient character when guaranteed at 65 points, and the Iron Priest at 60 points to give you rapid fire to some scary firepower seems like a very great buffing combo. He's going to be pretty monstrous with things like Ballistas, Dreadnoughts, Repulsor Executioners, or maybe Predator Annihilators. Will be interesting to see which of these see tournament play when people start to use the Codex for competitive games now. I guess it's live and out there in the wild now. For the Deathwatch, it seems that Games Workshop's happy with where they are at the moment. No points changes for the positive or negative, and no rules changes either. Currently for tournament performance, they seem to be one of the stronger factions in 40k, a small cohort of skilled players doing better than average with them. Win rates around about 53%, and some top placings at tournaments. Looks like they'll continue to be in a good spot rules power wise at least. Finally, for the Imperial armies, we've got the Black Templars. This has been an army that were struggling really quite a lot in the last few months. Lots of their units just having points increases to the points where they felt a bit mid. I feel like a few broad decreases were pretty much in order here. Seems to have got Helbrecht and Grimaldus both dropping 10 points. I think that's fair enough on both of those. They both felt a bit on the costly side at 130. Probably the biggest and most important change might be to Sword Brethren. They're now 140 points for 5 and 270 per 10. They perhaps more often tended to be fielded in 5s, given that them plus Helbrecht might well already give you enough damage to take down a massive amount of threats in the game. If you wanted to make them into a ludicrously big scary danger unit though, it's cheaper than it was before. And then finally the big Crusader squad drops down to 310 points from 320, but it's still more expensive to field them as a massed up 20 strong unit as opposed to a 10 strong one though. Overall definitely feels like a solid step in the right direction. Helbrecht and Grimaldus are nice. I feel like the Sword Brethren change is probably the biggest deal there. Feels like them jumping out of Templar Impulsors will be a good one to go for in the future. I guess it's not going to be enough to make them any sort of standout 40k faction, but hopefully will be solidly back more towards the mid-tier. Next up, we've got the Forces of Chaos, and starting out with the standard Chaos Space Marines. Looks like the Heretic Astartes got a few small points cuts, a Demon Prince change, some really quite significantly rewritten rules for Vashtor and the Lord Discordant, and then a new detachment focusing around sorcerers, maybe in a slightly similar sort of theme to the Space Marine Librarius Conclave. For points decreases, the Lord with the Jump Pack dropped down to 80 points, so he could be a bit more of a cheap threat with Raptors now. The Dark Apostle's down to 65, which seems quite nice for what he offers. He does maybe have the slight awkwardness without being able to fit very neatly in Rhinos and things, but I feel like for 65 points for his +1 to wound buff, and those Dark Disciples to potentially take a couple of hits for the unit, is not too bad. The Felgor Beastman dropped down to 70 points from 85, could be a bit more viable as a first turn annoyance option, turning up from strategic reserve early. The Traitor Enforcer is 55, and still is a bit of a weird unit that doesn't fit too well with the Traitor Guardsman he wants to lead. And the Master of Possession is down to 60, probably still most useful if you want to get an enhancement into a Possessed squad more than anything else. Most of those feel like they're more overshadowed units getting a bit more middling. Otherwise, the Foot Demon Prince gained the Lone Operative special rule if it's within 3 inches of Heretic Astartes infantry, so that puts him in line with the other deity ones. Things like the Emperor's Children and Death Guard ones got that. It definitely makes them a lot more interesting. Nice to have Lone Operative even conditionally on such a big scary model. And then after that we had a whole bunch of rules changes for both Vashtor and the Lord Discordant. Seems that Vashtor also picks up that lone operative style protection rule, which is kind of big for him. Instead he gets it when he's within 3 inches of a demon vehicle unit, so you won't be able to shoot him unless you're super close. That feels like really quite a big deal to me, particularly for a model with a fair bit of threat and isn't really the easiest thing to put down in the world. It's not too bad on the durability for his points just in the first place. Otherwise his Reorder Reality ability was buffed as well. Previously that just gave you hazardous if you were shooting him within 18 inches. Now it's -1 to hit as well as the hazardous ability, and if he's triggering lone operative I guess you'd have to get close if he happens to be near to other demon vehicles. His strength buff was previously a +1 to strength of nearby demon vehicles, now it's a +2, so another small improvement there, a bit more likely to make some break points compared with just the +1 strength it was previously. And then finally, on top of all of that, his melee profile's also been boosted as well. The sweep profile is far more punchy, getting 12 attacks at AP 1, damage 2 and devastating wounds, which is really quite nice and efficient for clearing out standard Space Marine equivalents. And the big harder hitting profile gets AP -3, so a good chance to reduce enemy armor saves a fair bit more even if it doesn't get the devastating wound lucky strikes. Overall that's a pretty sweet little collection of buffs for Vashtor. He's looking like a far more scary model for the points cost now. He's not the only one that got a big Chaos Marine rewrite though. As mentioned, the Lord Discordant got similar. This one's been a model that's just been very overshadowed for basically the whole of 10th edition so far. He's now going to be far better at actually catching things as he moves 14 inches rather than his previous 10. That was definitely a big downside to actually getting him to where he needed to be and not getting shot up loads first. His 5+ invulnerable save has been boosted to a 4+, which feels a bit more reasonable for the amount of points that you pay for the profile. He's still only got 10 wounds though. His Corrupt Machine Spirits has been taken down from a debuffing enemy shooting to dealing a bit more direct damage to an enemy vehicle, so you roll a dice and you get this many mortal wounds, potentially 3 mortal wounds if you roll a 4 or 5. Again, that seems more directly helpful, though still only good in certain matchups. And now his Spirit Thief rule against vehicles allows you to debuff one for Heretic Astartes being able to shoot it. Previously you had to be within 12 inches for that, now you just have to nominate a vehicle that you can see, so you don't have to be super close. Finally, that Impaler Chainglaive that he has been improved vastly in terms of its damage profile. Previously it was maybe slightly underwhelming, 4 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, and it's just been buffed across the board. 5 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, and it still has the lance keyword as well. With Dark Patch that's going to make it a very general purpose weapon, both capable of cutting down squads of elite infantry and punching up against tough stuff. Overall feels like for the points cost that he is, that's going to be a pretty reasonable boost, and I think it's going to be enough to make him useful. He still remains at his 160 points, but he's basically got faster, tougher, more dangerous, and while his rules still work against vehicles, at least they're more meaningful and easy to use. Finally for the Chaos Marines, they also got a new detachment as well. This one's called the Cabal of Chaos. It was one of the possibilities that I suggested might turn up when we found out that we were getting a Chaos Space Marine detachment. It did seem that it was definitely a possibility when they introduced the Librarius Conclave for the Space Marines. Definitely a theme that they could also go down with the Chaos Marines as well to reflect their sorcerers being used in battle. The core rule basically gives you a buff to your Dark Patch when you're within 9 inches of Psychers. Ranged attacks within 9 inches of Psychers that are making a Dark Patch get +1 to their strength. Nice enough for any general purpose Space Marine firepower out there. And then if you happen to be within 9 inches of a Demon Prince, melee attacks get AP -1 to their weapons there. I guess it's handy enough that the on-foot Demon Prince gets lone operative, as that could make him a better source of that now. For a few of the stratagems, they've got an infantry advance and charge one, a Psyche unit being able to generate a 6-inch aura of stealth, and an ability to heal some models as well, either D3+1 wounds to a Psyche unit or D3 battle line models. Again, I'll talk through this more in its own video. I'll admit at first impressions I'm maybe not super enthused about it in terms of their power sort of side of things. I feel like the Chaos Space Marine Psycho models just generally haven't tended to be super exciting so far in 10th. At first impressions, I guess that this one might be a bit more of a fun and fluffy one. I'll certainly have a think about it a bit more after looking through it properly later. Otherwise, for the Deity Legion Codexes, the changes were minimal. It looks like for Death Guard, Thousand Sons and World Eaters, mostly the only things that have turned up have been a few FAQs and erratas. This one's probably going to be most notable for the Death Guard, given that they seem to be one of the strongest factions in Warhammer 40k right now. They've had win rates in the high 50s, and a slightly disturbing amount of tournament victories in just a few weeks after their codex. It does really seem like they're one of the strongest armies in the game, some clearly undercosted data sheets such as the Death Shroud Terminators and Feated Bloat drones helping them to get there. I'm not sure they necessarily need much of an adjustment, but they do just look like they're some of the units that are clearly too cheap for what they do. Looks like on the point side of things, they've only had a small increase to Nurglings for their Taliban detachment. They're up to 40 and 70, the same as regular demons now. It looks like it was still too close to the codex release for Games Workshop to do any points changes immediately. They did get a couple of adjustments to their FAQ and errata document. It said that Death Shroud Terminators can't use their 6-inch drop outside of your own move phase, so no using it for rapid ingress or anything like that. And they did one for the Plague Burst Crawler Spore Mortal Wound type thing that it can do. Rules as written, you could read it as it just makes those units have to get mortal wounds for the rest of the game. That didn't really seem to be the intention for me, but they basically said that yes, that's not the intention, it just happens when you fire the crawler. I am wondering whether Death Guard might get some sort of emergency nerf, perhaps in a follow-up to the Dataslate. I guess it depends just how strong they are and whether they are indeed well ahead of everything else in the meta. It definitely seems possible they could get a similar sort of treatment to the Orks Mordaka. I feel like they could bear a few points increases and still be a very strong faction, though I guess we'll see what Games Workshop does. For the Thousand Sons, they only had their Codex points live last week, so they haven't had any more changes since then, and that's not too surprising. What they did get was a Codex FAQ, a few expected changes like the Aether Stride ability for a Demon Prince. That one is changed to 6 inches and only in your own movement phase, not the opponent's, so basically the standard sort of nerfs for 3-inch deep strikes there. A few stat line misprints, Vindicator's been changed to a 9-inch move, and the Flamers and Screamers to Leadership 7, I believe they were 8 in the Codex for some reason. Probably the most important of the FAQs was to the Cabal of Sorcerers. That's super important as their army rule, and there were people who were reading that differently. Basically, it is confirmed exactly as I thought it would be. The process is that when you're casting a psychic spell, you can first roll 2 dice, see if you like the result or see how high you rolled on them, and then only after that you can choose to channel the warp. So you get to decide whether or not you're rolling the 3rd dice in addition to those and try and stretch for, say, the boosted effect, for example. But it's only after the 3rd dice that you actually risk taking any mortal wounds. If you roll a double on the first 2, then you don't take any. It's only if you channel the warp that doubles and triples will cause you damage. That did seem to be the way that the rules implied to me. I could see the room for interpretation though, given the way that they laid it out in the Codex. One thing that doesn't seem to have turned up is the Rhinos having firing deck. I still probably guess that this one's an oversight or misprint, given that just about every other Rhino in the game has a firing deck. Maybe it'll turn up in some sort of future FAQ, unless it's some sort of balanced reason to try and make psychic shooting not work with a vehicle detachment, though I still probably guess it's an oversight, if anything. Like the Space Wolves, it's going to be interesting to see what people's takes on their lists are when they start to hit tournaments. For the World Eaters, they released at the same time as Death Guard, so for them there's also no changes to their recently released points costs. Initial impressions seem to have them fairly well balanced at tournament levels, getting sort of mid-tier win rates, and really quite a lot of high placings at events, though not quite so many tournament victories. I'm sure more will come along in time though. And again, they got their Codex FAQ, which for some reason hadn't turned up earlier. For confirmations here, they confirmed that the Lord on Juggernaut does indeed confer the Blessings of Khorne when it's leading a Juggernaut unit in the Khorne Demonkin. That does seem to have been how people were playing it previously. It means that he's really quite a powerful character to add for them, and that's basically an also-include little combo in the Demon Allied detachment, which is one of the competitive ones. Otherwise there's not much, just a small wording correction to the Warp Stalker's move through model stratagem, allowing it to work as it's clearly intended to for charges. Overall though, basically no changes. For the Emperor's Children though, it does seem that they've had some nerfs after they've been doing rather well at tournaments as well. Again, they did seem to be one of the strongest factions in 40k. They're maybe not quite as overblown numbers as the Death Guard. Win rates around about the 54/55% sort of area. They're generally using really quite a lot of very mono-build lists in Coterie of the Conceited. It's not like they have lots of datasheet options, but even within those, there's plenty of them that were just very clearly better than others. As a result, their nerfs will very directly affect army power, I suspect. Their Winged Demon Prints have gone up to 200 points. That was very expected given that they were being spammed in their competitive lists. Fast movement and big mortal wound impact hits made them very tempting. Lucius the Eternal goes up 10 points to 150. I still feel like he'll be solidly playable at that. Noise Marines maybe feels like one of the more painful ones, going up from 135 to 145. It's not quite as big as a jump, but to me they didn't really feel like a crazily undercosted unit or anything like that, so a bit of a shame to see the Elita Slanesh go up like that. And then for the other nerf, there's one of the enhancements of the Coterie of the Conceited, the Pledge of Unholy Fortitude, being able to change dice results to a 6 that goes up to 30 points from 20, and that was one of the more commonly played ones, quite nice for Demon Princes, so that's going to be a bit more if you want that now. Overall, definitely seems like a solid nerf to them. Fulgrim did go down a bit from 385 to 365, though at first impressions I'd guess that's probably not going to be enough to make him particularly strong relative to the rest of the army. Overall, between all that, I feel like it's really quite a direct nerf to strength, but probably not by quite so much that it'll outright make them bad. I suspect they'll be a bit more mid-tier after this, though I suppose we'll wait and see. Looks like Lord Exultants with Infractors probably got even more auto-include than before, if anything. Anything else in the competitive list that didn't get hit? It might have been nice to see a decrease on Flawless Blades. Otherwise, for the Forces of Chaos, the Chaos Knights didn't get anything here. No surprise at all there, though, given that they've got a Codex that's going on pre-order this week. Looks like we didn't get any sort of early points indications for them this time around, though. I guess they'll turn up in 2 weeks or so. Seems like the Codex is going to be the next big news for them. I'll certainly look forward to talking through it on the channel when we get some details. Finally, for the Forces of Chaos, we have the Demons themselves. The Dwellers of the Immaterium have been doing rather well in 40k right now, between Shadow Legion and Demon Incursion both being really quite viable. As it goes, I feel like they haven't done too badly out of this. They've had a few nerfs, but nothing enormous, and a couple of buffs as well. For the nerfs, it looks like Nurglings are 40 points for a small squad of 3 and 70 points for a squad of 6. It does appear that you can only field them in units of 3 to 6 now, as opposed to big units of 9. I guess that might stop them chaining out and screening out quite so much of the mid-board for infiltrators, and perhaps just a little bit less auto-include for the tiny squads of 3 of them, but it still looks like that's going to be cheap enough to be usable, particularly with infiltrators and just turning up to be nuisances. The Blood Legion gets a small buff in the Slaughterthirst going down a bit. This is the one that gives you an aura of lance attack to non-monster units, which is quite a nice damage buff for a fair few core units. Probably not super relevant on the competitive game though, given that I still don't think it'll be anywhere near as strong as Shadow Legion or Demon Incursion. Shadow Legion did get a couple of nerfs to enhancements though. Leaping Shadows, the Scout one, goes up to 25 points, a bit more of a premium if you want something like a Bloodthirster or Great Unclean one staging in the mid-board dead early, and then Fade to Darkness is now 30 points for the one where you charge in, destroy something, and then return to reserves. That one still looks like it's going to be well worth it on a Bloodthirster though. Being able to destroy something and then guarantee that you don't get slapped back is just a massive advantage, and then you can use Rapid Ingress to get the unit back in to do it all over again, turns in a row. Finally, the Scintillating Legion also got a small boost, so that's the Tzeentch one. One of their better stratagems got quite a nice buff. Now the Pyrogenesis one is only 1 CP, not 2, and that's the one where if you discard a Flux token, you get plus 3 strength and plus 1 AP for a unit's shooting. That's a pretty meaningful damage increase. It seemed like really quite a good deal at 1 CP in the Flux token. When it was 2 command points though, it certainly felt like it was paying an exorbitant premium. Overall though, it looks like Shadow Legion has taken a couple of small hits, though in general everything's pretty much similar to before. Seems like Demons were in a good place and still very much will be. Next up, we've got the Aeldari, and there were some rumoured changes to these guys. It seems that rather as expected, the Inari have been hit very hard indeed. They have got a few token points decreases to make a few things go the other way. First up, for the Inari detachment, the Devoted of Iniad. That was perhaps one of the strongest attachments in 40k, with a win rate of 60% or so, and having taken down maybe a disturbing amount of tournaments. No surprise that that got nerfed in a fairly big way. It does seem to be as it was rumoured more or less. Their big and maybe just slightly game-breaking ability in lethal intent now is just a lot more restricted. It only applies to Inari infantry or mounted models. Those models must have been within 6 inches of the destroyed Inari units that triggers the rule, and then those units can move d6+1 units at the end of your shooting phase, so no longer the just full unrestricted normal move, which could have you moving a seriously long way. So it's both going to be situational depending on where your units are set up, and you might want to cluster them together just a little bit more. The d6+1 inches could still give you a good movement, but it won't all the time and you can't rely on it. Otherwise, for direct things for Inari, the other datasheets were nerfed quite a bit as well. If Rain now only buffs units for reroll wound rolls of 1 rather than all wound rolls, and that just completely changes the theme of her unit with a whole bunch of incubi. Rerolling full wound rolls means that they could be a big threat to most things in the game. Now it's only ones it won't be. And on top of that, the Inari characters and some datasheets have gone up as well. The Incarn's up to 260, so a small nerf there. That one still looks good admittedly. The Archon's up to 85, Incubi are up to 85 per 5 as well. And then some of the better aspect warriors for Inari have also gone up as well. Fire Dragons up to 120 for the small unit, Howling Banshees plus 5 points per 5 of them, and the Autarch goes up to 85 points as well. That's a very common character choice. It also seems that the Seer Council has taken a hit as well, going up to plus 20 points for the 4-man squad. It does maybe seem a bit of a shame for that. They were good in Seer Council lists. It maybe just seems a little bit on the punishing side to give them quite a big points increase for that niche use. 4 points decreases, the Fire Prism drops down to 150, the War Walker down to 85, so maybe people might be tempted a bit more by that as a support vehicle now. Previously it was seen as just a bit expensive for its debuff. And Shining Spears go down to 110 points as well. Previously they were 120, so they are a bit more efficient there. Overall though, between all that, it looks like it's really quite a solid blow to the Devoted of Iniad. It was kind of expected, but feels like the Lethal Intent nerf was a big chunk of the change. I'm not sure they necessarily needed to hit both of Rain and the datasheets quite so hard at the same time. Overall though, I'd guess something else will emerge as the strongest thing for Aeldari now. Maybe it'll be Aspect Host, but I guess the points increases to certain units don't help there either. I still guess that Eldar overall will probably settle at around about mid-tier as opposed to being super weak, though we'll see on that front. Next up, we've got their Darkkin in the Drukhari. They look like they've got sort of middling win rates on the competitive scene at the moment, though there's not really many people playing the faction in general. They have had some fairly meaningful points decreases. Mandrake's dropping down to 65 points for the small squad, down from 70, and dropping 10 on the big squad. Raiders and Venoms both take a 5-point decrease. That feels like a small but very direct power boost to the faction. Cabalites in Venoms or Lilith or Incubi in Raiders are both quite nice. That seems like it very directly helps out Sky Splinter as well. And then the Ravager drops down from 110 points to 100. I feel like at that points cost for 3 Dark Lances, that's a pretty good deal. I really wouldn't be too surprised if a few people go for those instead of the Scourges now. Otherwise, they also had a nice rules buff for Reaper's Wager. That's the one where you have Drukhari and Harlequins, and it basically just gave you a big damage buff to the side that's winning the wager. Previously, you'd just get reroll 1s to hit and wound for the side that's losing, but now you also get reroll 1s to hit if you're winning as well, and often that'll be the side of the army that's most emphasised, often the Drukhari, as they'd have often got the last kill. So essentially it means that in this detachment, your Drukhari units will always at least reroll hit rolls of 1, even if they happen to have killed the last unit. That's a strong boost, and particularly in context of the transport and the mandrakes dropping down. Overall, it's not crazily enormous stuff, but I'd certainly expect this to increase the fortunes of the Drukhari out there on the battlefield. For the Leagues of Votann, they're still waiting for their codex sometime later this year. Most of their units are pretty playable, and the last few balance updates have been very light touch for them. For this one, it doesn't look like there's any points changes, and the only major rules one was that the Ironmaster and Grimnir now no longer have their Ecogs and Corvs take up space in transports, so that's going to make them a bit more viable fitting into Land Fortresses or Sagitors. It means that you could have a slightly meatier squad with a Grimnir and some Hearthkin in a Sagittor if you wanted to, though I still suspect that people might largely just want to field multiple small units. The Ironmaster still has his robot assistant as well, so I guess he'd be taking up 2 slots rather than 5. It does mean that the Ironmaster could go in a Hexon Land Fortress alongside a 3 of the Exoframe infantry, whereas previously he wouldn't have fit, so I guess that's quite a nice boost in terms of being able to use the transport that they're designed to use there. For the Tau Empire, they were one of the factions that clearly needed help. Win rates, tournament performance, and general army sentiment being a bit on the low side compared with most armies, and in general most of their units already feel like they're pointed at rock bottom prices for the faction compared with them historically. So if possible, a rules boost was preferred to more points cuts. Plenty of people were criticising the army's main rule, the For the Greater Good one, the one that has you work in pairs with a spotter unit with a guided unit, as it was just a bit clunky and hard to focus fire with things, and had all sorts of other downsides. It seems that Games Workshop have chosen to just rewrite this one though, and make it quite a lot more powerful. At the start of the shooting phase, observer units now basically mark units for non-observer units in your army. So you could have, say, like those units of stealth suits, choosing to be spotter units, and then marking certain units in the enemy army, and then rather than just having to pair with 1 Tau unit, basically all the non-observer units with the special rule gets the +1 ballistic skill, and ignores cover if you had a marker drone or something. So essentially you can have 1 unit, so you can basically have one of your units spot an enemy unit, and then that unit's kind of marked for the rest of your army. That is really quite a big buff compared with working in pairs. That means that the army might not be quite so affected by losing certain supporting squads. You still should be able to focus down the biggest and scariest things each turn with what you do have available to be a spotter. For a nice bonus as well, it also seems that this one has lost the downside of having -1 ballistic skill when you split fire, and that was really quite an annoying thing that probably just didn't really need to exist in the first place, as it meant that your big suits would often have a bunch of small arms weapons that were just kind of useless and couldn't even take aim at other things properly. That'll be helpful for the suits and tanks with secondary weapon systems, maybe stuff like the Storm Surge in particular. With the change to that army rule, a bunch of other rules have needed to be rewritten to fit in with that, and a few of them have been changed. It does seem that while the core army rule is fairly vastly buffed, Cao Yon has actually been downgraded for the core rule. Previously you'd get sustained hits 2 against anything that was your spotted targets. Now it's just sustained hits 1 whether you're guided or not, and you just get to ignore modifiers if you're shooting the spotted thing, so it's only really any good against stuff like stealth. Maybe they thought that just doing focus fire things and basically getting very easy army-wide sustained 2 was just too much on battle rounds 3 onwards. Otherwise, beyond that, the 2 enhancements that revolve around guiding units in the Cao Yon and Montcard attachment have had their wording tweaked so they work with the new rule, but they have also had big points increases through Unity Devastation for Cao Yon and Coordinated Exploitation for Montcard. Both of those are a big 40 points now. Still probably a bit borderline, even if you can mark a target and then have the rest of your units being a bit more effective against them with either sustained or lethal hits. The Firesight and the Stealth teams have been tweaked to match the new rules wording. Nothing really changed too much there. It does mean Stealth suits are still very powerful though, as one squad will be able to mark an enemy target, and then your entire army could be firing at that same target with reroll 1s to hit and wound. It seems that as a result, Stealth suits have gone up to 80 points for the unit of 3 of them. So if you do want to spam out the 3 units of 3 of them, as most people have seemed to do so far, that's now going to be 240 points rather than 180. It seems that the Pathfinders have a new ability. They were previously able to spot 2 units, now they're not able to do that. Instead they now get +1 ballistic skill and ignores cover against the only unit that they're spotting, so they basically get to use their marker lights for themselves. And that's pretty meaningful given they've got some fairly punchy ion weapon shooting. They don't have too bad damage output for their points even if they're kind of fragile, and overall that feels like a bit of a win for them. Otherwise looks like there's just been the one extra points change. Recruit Carnivores have gone up to 140 points for the bigger unit of 20. Seems a bit weird to be throwing around focal nerfs for things like the Recruit Hunting Bag and the Auxiliary Cadre, which is the only place that you really want to take those, I think. Not really too sure there was any big need for that. They'll still be nice and efficient, sticky objective units for 65 points elsewhere though. Overall that does seem like a good change for Tau, and a way to make the faction significantly more dangerous and easy to use without having to lower points costs yet again. Hopefully should be enough to get them far more back in the running in terms of competitive games. Next up we've got the Necrons. Generally they've been on the sort of upper mid-tier side of 40k for a while now. Seems they've got a few more buffs than nerfs overall. The Doomstalker drops down a tiny amount to 140, will still be alright in Canoptek Court, they would certainly take other things elsewhere. The Canoptek Wraiths did well, they dropped down from 115 to 110, and the Technomancer dropped to 80. They aren't huge points changes, but given that they're already a very competitive and well-played unit, that just seems like a win for them. A fair few Necron lists will be 15 points cheaper than they were. Death marks dropped down to 60 points per 5 of them. They're nice enough for cheap deep strikers with a little bit of anti-elite threat. Illuminor Seraz is 165 points now. Seems like solid utility for what you get between him being a lone operative with his nice battle line buffs. And the Plasmancer drops down to 55 points if you want to do some big battle line shooting combos. For the nerfs, individual Locust Destroyers are now up to 40 points. Plenty of people use those for sort of secondary and placeholder style units, so it might just be a little bit less draw to use them for that now. Otherwise, Games Workshop seem to have not liked the Scorpet Lord being played quite so much. He was often seen running around with 3 Scorpet Destroyers. It's gone up from 80 points to 90, and the Enagic Dermal Bond that he often wanted to use for the Feel No Pains in Awakened Dynasty, that's also been increased as well. Overall though, for plenty of lists that feels like it's broadly been more helpful than harmful. Maybe a side grade for the Awakened list that might have wanted to run multiple Scorpet Lords and Destroyers. Cheaper Wraiths is rather nice though, and Deathmarks and Saras both seem interesting at dropping down a little. Next up we've got the Orks, and as rumoured it does seem that they've taken more nerfs than buffs, though at least this time Games Workshop have finally gotten around to throwing a bit of love towards the speed freaks out there. Their buggy datasheets and detachment rules have been rather languishing in mediocrity ever since the Codex came out. Starting with those, it looks like they went the way of decreasing points costs on most of the buggers. The Squig Buggy, the Shock Drum Dragster, the Megatrack Scrapjet and the Custom Booster Blaster all dropped by 5 points. The Boomdacker Snazwagon went down a little bit more, down to 70 from 80. Deathcopters also dropped a touch as well, going down to 80 from 90 points, which feels like a more meaningful one compared with some. I feel like that maybe they were one of the better Speed Freak units already. Then for the detachment to run them in, the Cult of Speed was buffed, now allowing you to advance, shoot and charge. So it means that you can have some high-octane warbikers and deathcopters and buggers and things slamming into enemy lines after shooting them up a bunch. They're certainly going to be good on the Alpha Strike all game long, not just in the turn of the war. I feel like I would have preferred some sort of data sheet buff as opposed to just points decrease for the buggers. They're big clunky models with big bases, and there might be kind of diminishing returns to just putting literally more of them on the tabletop, but certainly is one way to increase a bit of efficiency for the speed war. Otherwise, for minor changes, they tweaked the bomb squigs, making their wording a little bit less ambiguous, just making sure that it's just 1 use per bomb squig and 1 use per turn. And Squighog Boys took a small points decrease as well, dropping down to 150 points for 4 of them from 160. They were generally considered to be a bit on the overcosted side. I'm not sure that makes them stand that good, but certainly a little bit more playable. That does seem to be where the good news ends for the Orks though. Quite a lot of options went up in cost. Maybe 2 of the options that were played by a lot of detachments are the Trucks and the Tank Busters. Both of those went up 5 points. Trucks are still good at 70 points I think, though it feels like they're getting less standout efficient after the repeated points rises. Tank Busters haven't gone up much, but 140 points is still worse. And then it seems that they're taking aim at a bunch of specific combo units. Shock Attack Gun Mechs go up to 85, and then 10 Strong Looters and Flash Kits both went up in points as well, even though the smaller units stayed the same. I guess that's maybe taking aim at the Flash Kits big combo in Tactical Brigade maybe, and the 10 Strong Looter mobs in either Dread Mob or Tactical as well. I'm not sure if these might have been the ones that they also decided to do based on more DACA. It does feel like the relevant units for those as well. Otherwise, also seems that 20 Strong Boy mobs have gone up to 170 from 160. Still not awful at that points cost. They were being used a fair bit with Pain Boys and Bosses, but not great if you did want a big horde of boys to go up the mid-board. And Zodgrob Wartsnagger also seems to have gone up to 90 points. I feel like most of these aren't exactly insurmountable, but not great for certain detachments if you were playing Tactical or maybe Dread Mob perhaps. And the Trox thing looks like it'll hit a whole bunch of lists too. Feels like there's maybe some residual punishment coming in from more DACA, even if that's already been nerfed into the floor. It seems that for tournament performance, Orc win rates were sort of kind of balanced at the moment. though it did seem like a few good Orky generals have been making big names for themselves at grand tournaments. I don't know if that might be part of the reason that they got more points increases versus a whole bunch of scattergun speed freak things. That's probably good for internal balance, though I still guess it's not going to be the strongest way to play Orks. Overall feels like it might just push them to be a bit more lower mid in 40k. I still guess not going to be one of the single weakest factions in the game, though I guess we'll see how it falls in the context of several other armies getting buffs. Next we've got the Tyranids, who had a rather big rules update in this one. Had a bunch of changes, 2 new Ravener datasheets, a new detachment in Subterranean Assault, and then they also seem to have an entirely rewritten Psychophage datasheet with a bunch of stats and abilities changed. First up, Hive Tyrants have got a side grade. Their discounted stratagems now just once per battle round, rather than being once per turn. Both they and Guilliman were maybe a bit of an oddball in that regard before, so it's more bringing them in line with things like captains. It has changed the way that they're played a bit, not being able to do both defensive and offensive stratagems each turn, but at least they cost a fair few less points. They've both taken some fairly solid points decreases, the regular Hive Tyrant dropping down to 195, the Winged one down to 170, and the Swarm Lord also has a decrease as well down to 220. Otherwise for point drops, the Hive Guard go down to 90 points and 180. That might be just about enough to take them from being an outright bad unit to more of a usable one. And nice to see another points cut for the Streamer Killer Carnifex as well. That's dropped down from 145 to 135. That does feel more in line with its abilities. It was generally one of the frontline damage dealer monsters that gets overlooked compared with things like Norn Emissaries and the big gun bugs. Otherwise, they've added in 2 datasheets for the new Raveners. These to represent the ones from the Kill Team Typhon kit. It's 125 points for the regular squad of 5 of them, and then there's one called Hyper Adapted Raveners that are 165. And apparently if you want to have one big mad unit of them, you can actually put the 2 squads together for one option to fill them for 290 points all mixed in, giving you a mix of the boosted ones and Synapse built in with the datasheets. And you could take enhancement on the Ravener Prime as well, as it's a character keyword model. Looks kind of interesting, and they'll replace the current 3 model version. Seems like they're going to be a bigger investment though compared with the cheap squad that you could have burrowing on and off the board that were fairly popular at the moment. I look forward to covering them in their own video later. That's definitely not all for the Tyranids though, as mentioned their Psychophage got a big boost. This is one that lots of Tyranid players will have in their collection given it coming in Leviathan and the starter sets. Usually very easy to obtain these online for nice and cheap. It looks like it will be going up from 95 points to 110. It now moves 12 inches rather than the 8 that it did before, so way faster. Instead of its datasheet rule giving you a 6+ feel no pain, you can instead mark a target for your units to be better with AP and melee against that squad. If you shoot it with its sort of flame style attack, apparently you make it easier to digest, and then other Tyranid attacks get an extra AP of 1 when you attack the same model. That does seem nice enough in combination with some Tyranid melee, particularly AP -2 things, and I guess it would allow you to buff his own melee too. It got a significantly more threatening melee stat line. 6 attacks now, hitting on a 3 at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2. That's way better than it was before. It'll actually reliably go through small squads of Space Marines. It's still far more dangerous against Psychers than elsewhere as well. I guess it'll usually be hitting at AP3 with its datasheet rule, and it's got the smoke keyword as well. I guess to represent those little spore chimney type things. Overall it does feel like a better datasheet, though given it was often used for the cheap 6+ feel no pain type thing before, it would have a bit of a different battlefield role there. I do kind of wonder if at 110 points whether or not it's actually going to be stronger than it was previously, or around about the same given the points increase. Certainly seems like a bunch of interesting changes though, could help support nearby Tyranids, has a bit more threat of its own right now, and of course it's going to be very useful in the Harvester detachment, being one of the keyworded units for the Assimilation Swarm. Finally for the Tyranids, and to celebrate the new Raveners potentially, there's a new detachment called Subterranean Assault, and this one's themed around sort of High Fleet Jormungandr, where you have basically Morlocks, Trigons and Raveners burrowing on and off the board, creating tunnels for other Tyranids to come in with. Raveners already get the burrower keyword on their updated datasheet. Trigons and Morlocks gain it in this detachment, and then 2 Trigons can be characters as well, allowing them to take enhancements. For the detachment rule, kind of surprisingly you get reroll 1s to hit for the entire army all the time, so just basically Tyranids in this detachment are more dangerous than elsewhere. And otherwise the core mechanic is that when burrower units arrive from reserve, they can place a tunnel marker next to them, and those tunnel markers can be used to arrive Tyranid units nearby. They arrive nearby the marker, and anywhere that's greater than 6 inches from enemy models. I guess that means that you could potentially deliver some units for 6-inch charges if you had some burrowers to guide the way. Those tunnel markers then remain on the board. The opponent can scrub them off the board if they go within 3 inches of them at the end of a move, but otherwise they can be used for some of the stratagems, having units moved around across the board via them, and a few other options with the stratagems. Otherwise they've got stratagems to return 2 burrowers to strategic reserves, which seems quite nice with generating those tunnel markers, and there's damage buffs for units that are jumping out of the tunnels, getting sustained hits 1 and ignores cover on all their attacks this turn. I probably would guess at first impressions it might not be the strongest way to play Tyranids compared with, say, Invasion Fleet and the direct damage buffs that they can get. Definitely feels like a fun and themed one though. At least on paper, being able to deliver Tyranid units really close to the enemy and get some big charges off with some direct damage increases at least seems like it could be interesting. It's maybe dependent on quite a small subset of datasheets being worth it on the front lines though to make it good. Finally for armies, we've got the Genestealer Cults. They didn't get too many changes here. The Atalan Jackals dropped down to 75 points or 150 for their bikers. They did tend to be one of the lesser played Genestealer Cult units compared with most, so maybe not too bad a change there. There was just a small update on their Resurgent points table. The 5-man squads of Jackals are now 2 Resurgent points down from 3, and 5 model Pure Strains are now 2 down from 3 as well. It means that they could be more viable options to return to the board and have jumped back onto the table again. Feels like at least on paper that one's particularly interesting for the Pure Strain Genestealers. Maybe not too uncommon to have them ranging out the front of the army doing infiltrate style things, and they could be a unit that's picked up fairly early, so potentially a nice one to recycle and have them come back swinging. That's all the Xenos factions though, and that means it's just about it for this one. Overall, a pretty crazy set of shake-ups for 40k. As usual, I'd say most of them are positive, though a few of them maybe seem a bit weird or disappointing. Definitely feels like there's some very big winners and losers with this one. Blood Angels and Sisters both did rather well. I'm really surprised to see Sanguinary Guard at 110 points, 130 felt pretty good for them. Admate look like they've done alright with cast down robots and cheaper disintegrators. The Dark Angels attachment looks really powerful, and the Lion looks far more tempting to put on the table. Good to see Black Templars going the right way. I quite enjoyed some of the nice focal datasheet updates they seem to do, going for a full redesign on things like Vastor, the Lord Discordant, and the Tyranid Psychophage. For balance things, I'm a bit apprehensive as to the Death Guard getting no points adjustments. Just seems that they were in a very solid place already, and a few of their competitors have been nerfed. Could be a good time for the Plague Legions in the near future. For nerfs, it feels like it's been a pretty bad time for the Aeldari and maybe the Orks as well, surprisingly. They certainly took a bunch more nerfs than I would have expected them to. I'm kind of interested to see the impact as to the new Tau detachment rule. Hopefully that'll be enough to put them back somewhere towards the midfield. They definitely seem like they're going to be a lot easier to coordinate their firepower now. In any case, loads and loads of changes. Let me know if I missed anything obvious down in the comments below. I'll aim to put a pinned comment down there if there's anything obvious that I've missed. Hopefully for the next videos, I'll aim to talk through those new detachments and then the new datasheets for the Tyranids and Admech. It will be nice to take a more focused look at those. Feel free to subscribe to the channel or check back later if you'd like to see them. Finally, before I go, I'll just cycle back to Titan's Terrain, today's video sponsor, with their pop-up cardboard terrain system, and talk through a few of their pros, cons, and different options to put it on the table. I would say that compared with most terrain sets, it does have its advantages and disadvantages. The main positives is that it's just really easy to store on transport due to being basically made of cardboard, all folding flat, and going into a tiny box like that. Obviously it's far cheaper than Games Workshop terrain, or at least somewhat comparable to things like MDF. It's not too bad for people on a budget, and it doesn't need any painting or assembly, ready to go straight out of the box. It's not too bad for people who don't have a huge amount of time to dedicate into things that aren't their primary armies. Perhaps for the major downsides, it's just a bit less sturdy and hard wearing than plastic or MDF, given it's made of cardboard. You do need to treat it carefully, and it's designed to fold flat, which means that you can't really put models on the upper floors of the buildings quite so much, as they'll probably struggle to bear their weight properly. The grid layout can be a bit limiting for some as well. It doesn't have as much flexibility compared with some terrain sets, and if it were me, I'd probably get just a couple of extra terrain bits to break up the major firing lanes it can create. I feel like that improves it significantly from a 40k perspective. It's not going to be a big tournament optimized table or anything like that. I've had good anecdotes that it works well enough for a casual gaming table for 40k. In any case, for a few of their options, they've got this Forgotten Furnace one, or Glowing Runes and Chaos Foundry type things. Quite a fun warped landscape if you ask me. They've got a more standard Shattered Hive one, which is all bombed out buildings and armoured containers and the like, a bit more of a standard ruins sort of set. And then they've got this Overgrown Capital, more verdant ruins with a grassy theme, and a terrain set that could work well enough both for fantasy or 40k style settings. Finally, they've got a few expansion and centerpiece sets as well, some big cathedral bits for 2 of them, and then an infernal spire that goes in the foundry one. The idea is that you have 2 tiles of these, and you push them together to make one great big structure. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video, and you can find them links down in the video description if you want to take a look over their things. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, including hopefully several more today for the other new update bits. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more, and check out the channel's Patreon page linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. It is the main thing that keeps the videos coming and allows me to do this as a full-time thing. There's a few advantages for patrons, such as seeing occasional videos early and regular votes to see what sort of things come next. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.